Vice President Biden has decided as part of his strategy for 2020, he is not going to be outbid on hawkishness on China. He's attacked President Trump again and again as actually weak on China, and the Biden campaign is positioning itself as tough or tougher on China than the Trump campaign. And COVID-19, the pandemic, has certainly become a fantastic opportunity for Biden in this way. He and his people do have a strong record on dealing with pandemic diseases in the Obama years, and they can say President Trump was casual, too trusting about China. But it's again and again something that people discover, that the way you talk in a campaign, however cynical you are about campaigns, it actually does shrink your options for what you do in government. If you campaign as a China hawk, you're going to be constrained to govern as a China hawk. And the Biden people, whatever their inwardmost intentions, that's where they're going to find themselves being. If you set up for conflict, conflict is what you get, if only because your people around the world hear what you're saying and take it more seriously, maybe even than you do yourself. So let's talk about what should be. You know, in the world of China hawks, there was a lot of criticism of people 20 years ago in the Clinton administration and the early days of the George W. Bush administration, who admitted China into the World Trade Organization, hoping that the China of Tiananmen Square would normalize into a more liberal society, a more open society, and a better global citizen. And I think the consensus in Washington, D.C. is that didn't happen. Those hopes were disappointed, and maybe the people who entertained those hopes were naive. As we enter this new, fiercer age of U.S. China competition, and as we head down a path of increasing U.S. China tension and even potential for conflict, I want to say a word on behalf of those people of the late 90s and early 2000s. It is always laudable to prepare for the best outcome. You prepare for the worst, but you hope for the best. But the hope should be more than just a wish. That you actually need to prepare for good outcomes too. And opening the possibility of a better U.S.-China relationship is something that we need to demand as much energy and as much seriousness, and as much seriousness from people who think of themselves as hard-headed as preparing for the worst. If you prepare for the worst, you're likely to get the worst. The United States and China are walking steps that point the way toward really serious conflict in the decades ahead. And that is not going to be good for anybody. So for those of us who take part in this debate, for those of you who consume this debate, for those of you who have influence, for those of you who are dealing with businesses and often, and in this environment where there's so many daily challenges to survival, let alone profitability, it's natural to not think about the broader term. But meanwhile, all around you, things are getting worse in ways that are dangerous for everybody. So I think all of us in our lives as citizens, in our interactions with elected officials, in our business lives, need to actively work for a better future. Because as it is, we are on a path that is leading to a very real prospect of the worst kinds of conflict between the two largest economies on earth.
No, I agree with that. I think part of the problem the United States has is that China, internally at least, has proved to be a much more immovable object than I think many people in the United States presume. You know, what you described as the hawkish critique of supposedly dovish policies, which is that they were naive about the kind of country China would become. And therefore, we need to shift toward a more hawkish approach. That's now been subjected to a market test. We've had 3 years of these supposedly more hawkish policies, and they haven't really produced the kinds of changes that their advocates suggest they would produce. So we've arrived at a kind of tautological moment where whether you're a dove or you're a hawk, China is proving to be more impervious to American pressure, either to integrate it into the world or to constrain its rise, than I think many Americans had presumed, which suggests that partly what the United States needs to do is to invest in itself and to try much more assertively to shape the world that China is emerging into, behaves in, and acts into, rather than trying at every turn to influence every point of decision that takes place in China. It doesn't mean we should stop trying, but it suggests that part of the challenge we have is that Chinese leaders have a very different vision than the Americans do of where their country ought to go, and in some cases, and increasingly, how the world ought to look. So, I think if Vice President Biden were to become president and comes into office and takes steps in the first instance to invest in American capabilities, the American economy, American science and innovation, but also, as you suggested at the beginning, to try to rebuild some of the relationships with partners who can help the United States to shape the rules of the international system and to try to mitigate some of the impacts of China's choices and behaviors. That would have a better chance of success than an American approach that just tries to attenuate the rise of Chinese power at every turn. Because what we're finding is that, number one, Chinese leaders are resisting that and have a lot of capacity to do so, at least internally. But second, a lot of countries around the world are not on board with an approach of relentless confrontation toward China for the very reason that you said, David. It is disruptive to their economies, to their interests, and to the stable global economy that they seek. So there is a third way, somewhere between relentless hawkishness and naive dovishness. And I think that's what the United States and other countries need to try to find.